decimals and percents. And one of the cool things about fractions, decimals, and percents, or sort of the big idea behind fractions, decimals, and percents, is that they are all different ways to represent the same number. So what we're going to be learning about today and what you should be taking notes on today is how fractions, decimals, and percents, we can convert them into just different ways of showing the same thing, which is a part of a whole, and more specifically, a part of one. So you can turn all of them into each other. Okay, so let's start. So the first thing we want to talk about is how we're going to turn a decimal into a percent. So the main thing we're going to do is multiply the decimal by 100%. We can do this and it will stay the same because 1 is equal to 100%. And if you multiply anything by 1, it stays the same number. It stays itself because of the identity property. So we would take 0.34 or 34 hundredths and multiply it by 100%. And we simply would end up with 0.34 times 100 would be 34, and then we have to keep our percent symbol because we're multiplying that in there, 34%. It's the same as multiplying by 1 because if I had 34 hundredths and I multiplied it by 1, I would end up with the same number. And then now that I've showed you how this 0.34 is the same as 34%, means 34 out of 100, so 34%, same thing. The reason why this is important, and it's important to note that it's multiplying by 100% and not multiplying by 100, is because we would end up with a different result. If you multiplied by 100, I would have 34 hundredths times 100, and then what do I end up with? I end up with 34. And that is not equal to 34%. That's equal to 3,400%, because that means I have 34 parts per every 100 that I have. So we don't want to confuse the two. Make sure you're writing all these notes down. Okay, next. The next thing we're going to do is just show how to translate a percent to a decimal. And what you do is you divide the decimal by 100%. In other words, let's say I had 78.6%. I'm going to go ahead and just divide that by 100%. I can also write it this way, 78.6% all divided by 100%. The reason why I want to point that out is because whenever you divide something by itself, you will get 1. So let's look at percent. If I divide this percent by that percent piece, I now have gone ahead and just said I'm going to turn that into 1. So that means when I divide 78.6 by 100, I'm going to just move my decimal points. And I'm going to have 786 thousandths. And that's my answer. 78.6% is the same as 786 thousandths. Okay? Now let's talk about how I can translate a fraction to a percent. And there's a few different ways to do this. One of the first ways is to set up an equivalent fraction, but we want 100 to be our denominator instead of whatever the denominator we already have is. So let's say I have the fraction for fifths. I want to multiply it by something so that I have some part over 100. Because percent literally means part per 100. So I always want something, my numerator to be over 100 and my denominator to be 100. Well, 5 times 20 is 100. Whatever I multiply on the bottom, I need to multiply on the top. 4 times 20 is 80. I now have 80 parts per 100, or 80%. Another way to do this we'll go over a little bit later, but I could also divide 4, because a fraction, this bar really is just a division symbol, 4 divided by 5, which would then give me 0.8. And that, when I multiply it by 100%, I would get 80%. So that's another way. The percent to fraction. So now this is just going backwards from what we just did. So very similarly, we're going to use 100 as the denominator, and the percent is simply the numerator. And then we simplify. So let's say I had 22%. Again, we're going to use the percent as the numerator. So that'll equal 22 over 100 as my denominator, 100. Because they're both even numbers, I can divide both the top and bottom by 2, and I will get 22 divided by 2 is 11, 100 divided by 2 is 50. So this 22% is equivalent and equal to 11/50ths. Make sure you're writing these notes down. Okay, the final conversions we need to do are decimals into fractions and decimals into percents. So we're going to use our decimal as the numerator, and then use the decimal place name value as the denominator. So let's use 2/10. Even as I say it, I know that 2 should be my numerator, and then because it's 2/10, the 10 will stay my denominator. Now I simplify. 2 and 10 are both even numbers. They both have a factor of 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Equals to 1/5. So that's how I change a decimal into a fraction. Now I just need to do a fraction into a decimal, so go the opposite way. And this is when we go back to remembering that the fraction bar is just another division symbol. 3/8. 3/8 means 3 divided by 8. Another way to think of this that I like to remember, 3/8, sometimes I get confused as what I do, so the top drops. Top one drops down, my 8 stays where it is, 8, 3 divided by 8. See how my 3 drops in? 3 drops. My 8 stays there, my 3 drops down. 3 divided by 8, when you do the math, you will end up with 0.375, or 375 thousandths would be your answer. Just to remember, if I wanted to turn this into a percent, now all I need to do is think about moving my decimal point 2 spaces, multiplying it by 100%, and I would have 37.5%. But the easiest way to turn your fraction into a decimal is just remember that they are ultimately a division problem. So here's what I'm saying. Oops, can't really see that, but here's what I'm saying. The big idea is that you can convert fractions to decimals to percents. So we can do a decimal. If I can convert that to a fraction over 100, then by definition, I can use the numerator as the percent, 34%. Another idea is that I can turn my percent into my fractions by saying this is equal to 78.6%, which means parts per 100, 78.6 over 100. And then I can come up with my decimal by moving. Notice the decimal point just moves 2 places, 0.786. So the moral of the story, the big idea that you need to take away, that fractions, decimals, and percents are all the same because percent simply means hundredths if you're reading in decimal form, or some number out of 100 if you're looking at this in fraction form.